Hello everyone, welcome back to our Spring Boot series. Today I will be talking about how to give names to beans. If you look into my previous videos, you will find one that talks about how to find beans, and you can even use the primary, qualifier annotations, and other strategies to find beans. But today let's see in how many ways can we give names to our beans, and you will see that you can explicitly give names to the beans, but also you can automate this task, and even based on the criteria that you decide, you can give specific names to beans. So first, what are beans? If it's the first time that you are here, I invite you to check my previous videos. But in a quick response, I can say to you that Spring Beans are classes that you want to be managed by Spring Boot because you want to do something about this class. Maybe you want to connect them, maybe you want Spring Boot to take one and inject in another class, maybe you want a specific class to participate in kind of integration scenarios, to be serialized, things like that, or maybe the class will be about configuration and you want to automatically create data source and things like that. That's what Spring Beans are. But of course, if you want more details, see my previous videos because I start from the basis. And now let's say I'm in a kind of a intermediate level on the Spring Boot. So, but let's see, let's talk about naming. So why naming matters? First, unique identification. All the beans should have a unique identification. Of course, because internal, there will be a kind of hash table with an internal registry of all these beans. So Spring Boot can find them and do something with them. So they should be unique, of course. That's why it's important, the name. Resolving ambiguity. Sometimes when we use, for instance, interface, and I've talked about this in my previous video, and you have several classes that implement the same interface, there is the risk for the bean to have the same name somehow or start to create ambiguities. And so in these scenarios, of course, we need to provide a way to give different names for these beans. And of course, improving code readability and maintainability. You should have good names, so it should be easy for you to identify the name of the beans. And of course, sometimes you need programmatic access. Usually we use annotations to find beans and inject the beans, but there is also a way for you to get, for instance, the application context class and say, give me this bean that I know that you have inside your registry, and you should provide a string, so you should know about the bean's name. So it will be useful for you to first understand how the beans receive their name, or the other ways, how can you give names to the beans when it's necessary. So first let's talk about the default bean naming. So Spring assigns default names if not explicitly provided following predictable conventions. Let's see what are these conventions. So if you are talking about class level annotations, beans that are class beans that you define, like component, service, repository, or controller, these are the stereotype annotations that mark a class as a Spring Manager component. By convention, the default name, it's the class name with the first letter converted to lowercase. If you don't give a name to the bean, it will take the name of the class, put the first letter as lowercase, and that will be the name of the bean. So let's say an example, we have a kind of this class here, my service, the default name will be this one, my service, which will be this M lowercase. That's the way that Spring Boot does by default, but sometimes these create some conflicts, mainly if you are using, for instance, interfaces. So there are other type of beans that you can create, as you know, which is to use the annotation bean in a configuration class. Sometimes when you have this configuration class, you can create beans using methods. So the instance of the bean will be the return type, but the name of the bean will be the name of the method. And again, usually with a lowercase of the first letter, but it's common in Java for the methods to be lowercases, so usually it's not an issue. But sometimes people think, okay, it's the name of the method. If it's capitalized, it will be a different scenario. So remember that always Spring Boot likes to lowercase the first letter. So you can use somehow usually the name of the method, it should be a singular name between the methods, unless you have other classes configuration where you have the same method name. And in those cases, you want to give a different name to the bean, and we will see in a moment how can we do this. So another way is you can explicitly define the bean names using various annotation attributes. Let's see how we can do. By default, if you put a string between parentheses on the annotation, like for instance this component or service or repository, this will be the name of the bin. It will not be this one, but it will be this one. If you try to address this one, it will not be found, because you are saying to Spring Boot now, and I want my bin name to be this one. So this will be the name that you should use if you want to address explicitly to find this bin. Of course, if you are injecting based on the type, this name will not be relevant, but if you use a qualifier or you want to get this bin with application context, you should provide this name and not this one with a lowercase c. Okay, when should we use the explicit naming? When the default lowercase class isn't descriptive enough. Sometimes there are classes like something like user service impulse version 1. It's not a good name for a bin. You usually want something more business, and you just want to use my special component, or even probably user service implement and without the version 1. So in those cases, you want to give some special name here on the component. And of course, when you are using legacy systems integrations, imagine that you have applications that you are migrating, are integrating your Spring Boot application, and you are integrating with older systems or third-party libraries that expect specific bin names, meaning that you are integrating here and they expect some bin names that you are replacing with the others. So, and you don't want to use those names for your class names. So you can still develop using great guidelines and good programming practices and maintain the compatibility with the previous version by providing the name that is expected by the legacy model or application or classes belonging to the Spring Boot. Another way for you to give the bin names, the names for the bins. Here we saw at the class level. Now you can use the same approach when we are using the annotation bin. In this case, you should use the name here, for instance, and you put here the string. This will be the name of the bin and not the method name. In this way, you control the name, so you avoid some ambiguities or conflicts between bins with the same method names in different class configurations. Okay, here are some of the topics that you can decide when to use explicit or not in these cases when we are using this annotation bin. Okay, so when you have multiple instances of the same type, meaning, for instance, it's not the case here, old service and new service, but it's quite common when we are using data source. Sometimes you have multiple ways to create the same data source, and we want to provide different, or we want to control the names of the bins, so we can inject this data source in our repositories, and it should be clear which data source is being injected, and the name should be readable for the developer. Okay, in those cases, you want to give explicit name for the bin. Of course, readability, it's always a factor to consider. And this one is quite important, maybe the most important, which is about refactoring. If you don't use the name here, by default, and imagine that you use a qualifier targeting this name for this bin, and now you say, okay, this is not a good name for this method, and I want to refactor this method. But the name of the bin, it's the method's name, and probably you are using in a qualifier inside the string. So the mechanism to refactor, it will not rename the string inside the qualifier. So when the application starts, it can start to fail. So one of the things that I can let's say give to you for free is if, for instance, you start to do some refactoring and the Spring Boot application is not starting anymore, look for qualifiers that were using specific names of the bins and check if your refactor rename one of those bin names. You can apply this knowledge to this bin, and even at the component level, even the class name, it's relevant for this. So that's one of the reasons, and the strong reason for you to use names, explicit names for the bins. It's when you want to maintain some quality on the code, and sometimes you need to refactor, and you can refactor methods, but you can also refactor classes like these ones. Okay? For instance, this one, not this one, the previous one, for example, this one. And the name of the bin will change internally when the application starts. So there is another concept that sometimes it's useful. It's called bin aliases, and it's to give multiple names to a bin. Okay, The one way to do is by default, this annotation. In this annotation, you can provide an array of strings like this. And in this case, this bin here, this data processor, can be found by any one of these three values. There are use cases where this is useful, mainly when you are integrating other applications that expect specific names. And sometimes you don't want to change the current names because they are already there, but you need to provide new names for other applications. Or maybe you are in a, let's say, a migration of the old code to new code, and the names were not good enough, but you don't want to break your code. So you create an alias, you add a second alias or a third alias, and you start to use the new ones until you are sure that these ones are not used anymore. Maybe you can try to remove and start your application, and then you start to clean from the, let's say, the left side, the oldest ones, and start to use the new ones. That's one of the scenarios for you to use this alias on the bins. So when to use alias, backward compatibility, as I was saying, contextual naming. If a single bin serves different roles in different parts of the application, alias can provide more context-specific names without duplicating the bin definition. Sometimes you have a data source that maybe it's used in two different places with two different purposes. Maybe there are, let's say, two sets of tables that represent two different scenarios of your business, and it should be probably two different data sources, two different connections with two different users, for instance, but it's an old code and you want to maintain the compatibility, but you are migrating to the new code. You are trying to refactor to make your application more, let's say, in an harmonious, let's say like that, following the good practices. So you have a kind of a alias that targets the business, the old business, and another an alias to target a set of tables that are new or represent a different schema or different area of your business. And you can use the same data source, but when you look for this bin, use a different name. Later, you can even create another bin, and you can just remove this alias and put in two different bins. And then it should work when you finalize, for instance, your refactoring or the improving that you are doing to your code. If you are using all those versions of Spring, you can also define at the XML level. Today, we usually use annotations, but there are still old code that use XML. In this case, you can use the alias tag like this, and you can provide the name of the alias for this bin. It's a different way if you need to use the alias. So alias, it's not a new feature. It always existed, but it's simpler to implement usually in annotations, but it's also possible in previous versions of the Spring using XML. What if there are some conflicts when we create these names? What can we do to avoid this? One is to use Qualifier, and I explained this in detail in a previous video if you look for in my channel. But the idea of the Qualifier, it's when you have the name, this one or even this one, it's not relevant if you know the name of the bin, and sometimes you want to remove some ambiguity. For instance, in this example, we have this interface called notification service, and both these bins implement this notification service, okay, using by using this interface. And when we try to inject and we use the interface here, okay, you want to provide the different implementations, the email and the SMS one. But the variable here are defined using the interface. So Spring Boot cannot guess which data type do you want, which bin do you want, because this is the interface, and the interface, it's implemented by both email and SMS, so it doesn't know which one to choose. And in this case, you want to use the qualifier and provide here the name of the bin. In our case, it will be this name because we prefer email service over email notification service. But if you don't have this name, it also works, the qualifier. Of course, it will be email notification service, again with the E in lowercase, and the same, of course, applies to SMS. And in this case, you have to use both qualifiers to distinguish between the email service and the SMS service. That's the common use of the qualifier. It's when we have ambiguity. So when do you want to use the qualifier? when you need precise control, like the one that we saw moments ago. Context injection, different parts of your application might require different implementation of the same interface. It's the same concept of the precise control, and it overrides primary, and I'll explain in a moment what is primary. If both primary and qualifier are present, qualifier always, this is the important concept that I want to make sure that you understand, qualifier always takes precedence, providing explicit control. The qualifier, there is no conflicts inside the qualifier. You have the qualifier, provide a name. It doesn't matter what other mechanisms are you using to find beans, the qualifier always prevails. So this is our example, a visual. So we have this interface here, the notification service, and we have the email notification service and the SMS notification service implementing this notification. And the issue here was that our email service and SMS service were using this notification interface. So there is ambiguity because we have two beans, but when we declare these variables, and you can see here they use the same data type, so Spring Boot cannot guess the bean by the data type. That's why we should use the qualifier. The primary annotation is another way to find beans, and usually it doesn't care about the name of the beans. The main idea of the primary is, again, if you have, for instance, this REST data service and database data service implementing the same interface, again, we have an ambiguity. And if you don't want to use the qualifier, you can use primary. The idea of primary is, okay, if you find ambiguity, try to find the bean that contains the annotation primary and use that. I don't care what are the others. This is a great use case when you are migrating some code, but you don't want to break the things as is, meaning that the beans that are working, you are adding additional beans. Imagine that the first bean that you created in an oldest application was this database data service, and now in some scenarios you want this REST data service. So you mark this one as primary. It assures that your application will work, because there will not be ambiguity. Every time there is an ambiguity, Spring Boot will find the primary and will use the primary. And then you can inject this one, for instance, using the qualifier. Since the primary always prevails on the data type, you use for your new code the qualifier to find the REST data service. That's one of the uses of the primary that works quite well with the qualifier in this kind of scenarios. So this is our data consumer. So when to use primary, default implementation, when one implementation of an interface is significantly more common, or it is default choice across application, usually to maintain some compatibility and to avoid some breaking behavior on the application. It's simplicity, because it's quite simple to use the primary. It's clear that the purpose is just this bean always prevails, unless if you use a qualifier. The qualifier, remember, always prevails even over the primary, and other parts of the application can still use the qualifier to explicitly inject a non-primary bean if needed. Because remember, if you don't use the qualifier, the primary one will always be chosen. So if you need the other one, of course, you should use the qualifier. So this is a table if you want to pause and check the summary of what we said about the difference between primary and qualifier. The purpose of the primary is to be the default. The qualifier is to find the exact bean. Granularity, it's quite broad, because if you have 100 beans and 30 of them are primary, that applies to everyone. It doesn't care how many beans. The primary will always prevail unless you have a qualifier. And the qualifier, of course, it's fine-grained, because you have to explicitly say, I want this bean in particular. The precedence, it's lower than qualifier. Qualifier has the highest precedence, always prevails over other mechanisms to find beans. And use cases, of course, the primary is one preferred implementation among many. Okay, the qualifier is choosing between specific implementations at different points. So it's one, I have many of them, and I just one in specific here, it's the primary one. And of course, the qualifier, I want to choose which ones I want to find, which, of course, beans that what we're talking about. And from the developer point of view, the primary, it's by default, use this. That's the sentence that you can memorize if you want to understand when to use the primary. And the qualifier is specifically use this one. That's if you want to answer this question, it's primary. If you want to answer this question, it's qualifier. It's a good tip for you to follow. Okay, recommendation, use primary when you have a clear, widely used default implementation. Use qualifier when you need explicit control, as said before. Okay, advanced custom naming strategies. This one it's not probably very well known between developers, but sometimes it's useful, and it's the use of BeanNameGenerator. Let's see what can we do with this. So it allows programmatic control over bin name generation for component and its stereotypes, meaning scanned bins. Typically, you extend annotation BeanNameGenerator, or you implement. I will show you in the slide here using the extends, but in the example I provided the implementation, so you can see that there are some, you can use both, but the most let's say current versions of the Spring, they usually prefer annotations or implementing the specific interfaces. But I like to address both cases because a lot of code exists, legacy code or old code from previous versions of Spring Boot, so I always address the both approaches. So again, typically you extend annotation bin generator name and override the method generate bin name. So you will give a name to the bin in a programmatic way. Let's see how can we do this. So if you use the extends, the way to implement it's the same method, but there is the implements version that I'll show you in my code walkthrough after this slide. So you have this public class custom bin generator. You just create a class, extend from this class, and then you have to implement this method generate bin name, and you receive the definition of a bin and the registry of the bin. Spring Boot will give you access to this. So the first thing that you can do, you can say, okay, by default, give to the bin this name, and which bins are these ones? All the bins of your application. So what will happen is that after you implement this, you will, of course, you should inform Spring Boot, and I'll show you in a moment how, that this method exists, this generator. So every time the Spring Boot is starting and defines a bin, it will call this method, and you provide the name. And it's a good practice for you to say, okay, by default, I will give the name, the generated name of the bin that is defined by default by Spring Boot when you are extending this class. Okay, you can something like this. And now you just implement the exceptions. You can say something, imagine that you are trying stuff and you want to differentiate your bins from the others. And you can say something, if definition get bin class name, meaning you can get the name of the bin, so the class that is behind the bin. And in this case, you can say, okay, get the package name. And if the package starts with something like this, for instance, prefix the bin name with experimental and provide here the default name that was generated. So the bin will be generated with this value. And when you need to find this bin by name, like a qualifier, for instance, or using application context, remember what you developed on this method. Sometimes these things are quite useful, but they hide things that can be difficult in the future to find. And sometimes it's necessary to have experienced developers. Imagine that you develop this, now you quit your company, and then after a year, someone wants to use a qualifier on a specific bin and use the class name. And he finds out that the bin is not being found. And unless he's experienced to try to find if someone extended this class and start to generate or custom generate the names, it will be very difficult to find this issue. So it should be very well documented. Fortunately, the definition of this method, it's on the main class where the bin starts. So it should be easy for someone that's usually know about this stuff to find there. But it can be a tricky thing to find on a bug that it's quite simple to find if you know about this feature, but it can be difficult for someone that is, for instance, a junior person. So be careful when you use these mechanisms. Document these mechanisms quite well. Maybe put on the README if you are using GitHub or something on your application. Say, okay, we use in this application custom bin name generators. So people, okay, that's important for me to know. If I want to use qualifiers or bugs that I'm getting on the application about the names of the bins, now I understand why the bins have different names. And for instance, here you can say, okay, you find this experimental, or maybe if the name of the class ends with repository, you just want to suffix the name with repo. sometimes people say, okay, why is this useful? It can be useful, for instance, if you use tools like, for instance, ArcUnit. ArcUnit, it's something that I will address in my future videos about testing, that allows you to query your Java code and create unit tests at architecture level. You can, sometimes you just want to say, okay, find me all the beans that end with repo, okay, and check if they are on a package that is, for instance, your package of your company dot repositories. And this ArcUnit tool can do that. And sometimes if you can standardize somehow some of your beans, you can apply these rules even for new developers. If they put a bean in a different package, you can say, okay, but this bean is about repository, it should be on a package named repositories. That's one of the usage for this kind of custom bean name generators. So the way for you to add this generator, you just add this component scan and just put the class here. You have a property called nameGenerator, custom bean nameGenerator.class, and I will show you in the code walkthrough in a moment how you can do this, but this is the only thing that you should do. Just put this name here, which is the class that you created here. And that's it. No properties files, no XML files, no environment variables, nothing, just this. Okay, when to use custom bean name generator, highly dynamic naming, when bean names need to follow complex non-standard rules that cannot be achieved with simple value attributes. For instance, the scenario that I gave to you, in your company, you have rules that you want to check on your beans. Enforcing naming conventions, again, automated integration for frameworks or libraries that dynamically create Spring beans and need specific naming patterns. Sometimes it exists in some generators on some frameworks that you want your application to be available, maybe your jar, and they try to find beans with specific names. There are rules there. It's not popular, but it exists. And sometimes you need this feature to make sure that your beans that belong to your application, you want to differentiate them somehow. It's okay, find these beans that start with these letters. And of course, you need a custom bean name generator. And rarely needed for most applications, explicit name with component or bean are enough. But okay, but sometimes there are scenarios, and that's why I wanted to present this in this video. So example with a custom naming generator. So you have this component, experimental feature, and after you execute that, the name of the bean internal will be this one, and the repository will be this name. Not user repository with a U lowercase, but this will be the name. But you can see the U is lowercase because in our code, if you remember, we start the default name by using this super generate bean name, meaning get me the default behavior, and then I will do the rest. Okay, this is just the thing that we were talking about. The Spring Boot, don't forget to use this component scan, the name generator. This class, of course, the custom bean generator, links to your custom bean generator where you have the implementation of this class for this method. And we are addressing this experimental and repository, and with some comments if you want to just a visual of this, what I was explaining. Sometimes I like to give diagrams because too much text, it's too much imagination. And when we show the boxes, okay, I think it makes the concepts clear. Okay, best practice and considerations. Consistency is key. Adopt a consistent naming convention through your project. Readability and clarity. I think that these are the common guidelines. Always be clever, be wise when you are giving names. Go with the principle, keep it simple. That's usually the approach that you should give. Only go to the exceptions when you really have exceptions in your code. Don't try to, and I speak for myself, in the past I was like that. Okay, I have a custom bean name, that's great, so I will standardize all my beans. Yeah, it's not a good idea. The class should have good names, so the beans can have good names, and use the custom bean generator only when you have exceptions to say, okay, this class, it's a legacy one, it has a crazy name, I don't like this name, I will provide different names for these beans. Usually my legacy code belongs to these specific packages, so the beans, all the beans on these packages, I will start them with this, let's say, legacy, so I can find them easily. And in my new code, I can check when I'm using a legacy bin or not. That could be a great use case for this kind of scenarios. So debugging applications, remember that custom names affect how you retrieve beans from the application context. Again, something that I said before, be careful with the names that you give, because once in a while you need to use application context or bin factory to get beans by name, and you have to understand what are the names of these beans. Okay, aliasing for transition, as the use case that we talked about previously. You want to use alias for different purpose. And primary and base qualifier, remember that qualifier always overrides the primary. It doesn't mean that it's better than the other one. Again, this answers the question when you want to choose a precise bin, and this is, you want to use primary when you want a bin to rule over the other ones that implement the same interface. Naming conflicts, be careful with that. Usually you know that there are bin conflicts and you receive this exception, no unique bin definition exception, usually at the start, but sometimes it's not at the start if you use annotations to delay the creation of the bin, so be careful with that. External libraries, when defining bins for a class. For third-party libraries, bin methods are your primary tool for custom naming. And I created a video in the past about when to use these bins, and usually it's when you need more customization or you don't have access to the code. So you cannot use repository or service, and you just have to create a method that creates an instance of that class and return it as a bin. Default naming, Spring uses lowercase class names as a summary. Explicit naming, you can use it using the value or the name. You can use alias, meaning that you can give multiple names for the bin. When you have conflict resolution, remember primary or qualifier. You can achieve advanced naming using the bin name generated. But again, best practice, prioritize clarity, consistency, readability, name. Remember that the code that you develop, it's not for you, it's for your colleagues, even those colleagues that you don't know yet, because they will enter into your company maybe in 1 month, half a year, 1 year, and so on. So use advanced options only when necessary, favoring always simpler approach first. So this is what I wanted to show you and to present you about the naming of the bins. And let's see some code. I prepared here, quite simple code for you to understand. So what I did was just to, in our class h2 database config, by the way, as you know, this code, it's always in GitHub, and I have the address of this GitHub in the posts of the channel. You can find them there, and usually I create a commit message for a specific video. This one, I don't remember if it's 39 or 40, and in this case, there will be a commit with the name, with the number of the video. Yeah, but usually the commit also contains a message with the title of the video, so it should be easy for you to find. But you can check out and you can explore and even execute the code and try your scenarios if you want. So in this case, I have this bin and I create here an alias. So by default, it is this data source. I didn't want to break this. That's why if I wanted to use in other parts of the application that were already using the data source, so I put it here, the name that is expected, but I added also, meaning that the database, it's h2, so I create the h2 data source. This will allow me in the future, if I want to address or create a different data source for another database, and I create, for instance, Oracle data source, MySQL data source, and so on, and so on. Okay, this is one of the ways to do. So we have here alias. I have also another alias here, JDBC template h2. Again, this JDBC template is used in some parts of the code. I didn't want again to break the code, so I create an alias and added this h2. So this will create a JDBC template h2 with this data source, h2 data source here. That's one of the things that I did on this code. The other thing was I created a BeanGenerator name here, and you can see here that I using my BeanGenerator, and I'm using not the overrides as I talk in the slides, but using the implements. It's another way to do, but at the end of the day, you have to implement the same method called generate bin name, and you receive the bin definition and the registry. And in this case, I'm just getting the bin class name, checking if it's not null, and if it contains the repositories when it belongs to this package here. I will prefix the bins with the rep. The same for the services, and you can see here the services, which will be these bins here, and I'm prefixing with the serve. And for the rest, my REST controllers that are in the package REST here, I'm prefixing the name of the bin with REST, and we will see what it happens. For the other beans, I just get the definition, get bean class name, which is the default one. So it should be this one, which is given by default by the Spring Boot. So what I want to show you, I'm not forgetting. Okay, I just want to show you here. So here I'm using also the qualifier, so you can see an example, and targeting the alias. These alias here that I created. Again, it's here. You can see this one, the H2, this one, JDBC template H2 here. I'm targeting here. Maybe this is here on the qualifier, meaning that I want to use explicitly this one. Of course, this JDBC template here, the data type, it's also this one. So it will not, it was not necessary for me to use the qualifier, but that I want to show you the qualifier targeting a specific alias and not the default bin name. Okay. So let's see our repository here. This is the qualifier, and I'm injecting JDBC template, and we will see this working because I will call an API here to get the categories, and we will see this working. So let's go to our REST here. I can show you the code for the rest. So this is calling our Spring Boot application. If you want to know more about this application, it's an application about financial. There is some REST controls. You can download the code. It's quite simple. Get categories, entities, transactions, things like that. And usually this data is created here. These are the tables created automatically using H2 in Spring Boot. And this is the data that it's inserted when the application starts. Okay. So let's go to our REST here. Categories. So here I'm targeting this REST with a get, so it will list the categories. So I'll play here, play, and you can see the categories here. And remember, these categories, it's where our repository exists and where we are using the qualifier. So it's working, the alias as expected. For the beans, so you ask, but how can I know that the beans were prefixed with that name? Which, by the way, I was forgetting. Okay, this is where you define, as I explained in the video, the class myBeanGenerator. Okay, this one, myBeanGenerator, this class here, it's here on the component scan. Okay, that's why it works. So how can we be sure that the beans were generated with those prefixes like the rest, the beans? One way is for you to try to inject the qualifier and check if it finds the bean or if it breaks because it doesn't find, because we changed the name. Another way is using actuators, and I talked about them in the past. And there is an actuator here that I'm calling, which is the actuator beans. There are a lot of actuators regarding a lot of information. It's a kind of observability. Spring Boot provides you ways for you to check the internals of your application. One way is to check all the beans that are defined and found by Spring Boot, and you can find them here. If you want to know how to define this, if you want to start quickly and you don't want to see my previous video, you just go to the application properties and you should provide here this, at least this entry, management endpoints web exposure include, and use this. You can define here which actuators do you want. If you would just use this symbol, you'll get access to all of them. Okay. So when we execute this one on this address, meaning our application actuator, this is where the actuators will be available unless you change them, the place, and this will return you a JSON with all the beans found by Spring Boot, and that's what you can see here. So when you call this get, you can use a browser. Usually I prefer a REST client like this. This is the output, and you can see all the beans that we are creating. And you can see, when you look into this, you can see beans, for instance, and for each one of the beans, there are some beans that were not created by us, they are provided by the Spring Boot. You can see there is something that it's alias, the scope, something that we already talked in the past, and there are even dependencies, the data type, where is the class that it's related with this bean, and so on. So let's try to find ours. Let's start from serve like this, and you can see that we have here on our bean here that is a categories REST controller here, and the name you can see that is prefixed by REST. Okay, because we said to be like this, you can check the code. You can say here REST for the REST controllers, meaning the beans that belong to this package. And you can see they belong to this package because it's here on this package. So we prefix the bean like this. By the way, this is how the bean is registered internally by the Spring Boot. Of course, the name would be something like this unless we provide this REST-com before. And now we have alias, the scope, the type, which is the class that is the bean. Okay, this is the resource which comes from the file. And you can see here the file. And then you have this dependency. Dependency, it's another bit that depends on this, which is the service. But you can see even the service already contains the prefix. So we have the REST, we have the service. And if you try to find the REST controller, the repository, we should find rep. You can see here a repository here, which is the entities repository, was prefixed also with the rep. And now for the aliases, you create that alias with H2. Let's see, where can we find him? H2. Let's see. This is the database config. It's not what we are looking for. Let's try to find other ones. And you can see here that we have this bean called data source with an alias which is called H2 data source. And this one, this H2 data source, is nothing more than this alias. You don't see here the data source. You see here because this is not the alias, this is the name of the bean, and this is the alias, and you can see it here. This is the name of the bean, and this is the alias. This is the name of the bean, not because I wrote it here, but because it's the name of the method that it's here. So it's the same, so it will be the name by default of the bean, but this is a different way to get the same bean. So this is what I wanted to show you, the advanced scenarios for you to name the beans. So this video with the other video that I created about how to look for beans, and this one how to name the beans, the two together, I think they give you a great and deep picture about how to handle the finding and naming and registry of the beans in Spring Boot. So I hope you like this video. I hope it's useful for you. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, share with your friends, share on your social networks. It's always motivation for me to create additional videos. I create all of them for free, as you know, with a lot of different subjects. And usually my concern is that I want to make you a better software engineering and even an architect if you want, because mostly of the subjects that I put on my channel, it's about architecture. So I hope you like it. I hope you follow me. Be free to comment, give me tips, something that can make my videos better, because I know that I really talk too much like I'm doing now, but I really like to explain in detail everything, and I think I can, or at least I think I give value to all the things that I explained. So again, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in my next video.